morning, everyone. My name's Andrew Lemieux. I work for Lead Conservation, running their Lead Analyst program. My role today is to be the moderator of this event, but I'm also going to set the scene a bit using some information that's already available on what we know about preventable deaths, or at least deaths in ranger operations. We've got a great panel here in front of us. We've tried to save time in the panel on introductions by providing little handouts for everybody about who we are and what we've been up to. I apologize that it looks like an FBI's most wanted list. There's a bunch of scumbags on there, but it's really nice to be here. And let me go ahead and kick this off so I can turn it over to the professionals who know more about this than I do. So one of the things we got to start with when we talk about preventable deaths in ranger operations is at least some sort of working definition on what we're talking about. And as a group, we kind of decided that one of the simplest ways to define this is a death which is considered by expert consensus to be preventable by best available care, okay? So the idea is that after an injury occurs, there's different levels of care that can be provided, both by teams on site as well as, hospitals afterwards. And what we're really talking about here today are deaths that could have been prevented had better care been provided because, there might have been a lack of training or a lack of infrastructure, whatever it is. But that's what we're talking about in preventable deaths in ranger operations. And just to kind of zoom out a bit, if we think about when a preventable death might occur, how we might start assessing what was preventable or not, if we look at a very simple timeline, at some point a ranger is alive and safe. They then enter an activity, which at one point or another results in an injury. And then we enter what happens after that injury, right? There's a treatment phase right on site of first aid's usually given. There's an evacuation usually to a better level of care, and then they receive better care in the hospital. And sometimes that ends up in a death, right? And what we're looking for in this talk, and what we want to discuss more and more, is on the top, we've talked about ways that we might be capturing data about what's happening in these different phases, right? So the activity, usually you're going to do some sort of threat assessment to determine what is the threat that you're putting, the ranger into, the level of threat during that activity. Then there's the injury. We can capture injury data, what actually happened. But then there's these different phases that we'd like to start collecting information about, because it starts to tell us when treatments are working, when evacuation protocols are working, and when hospital treatment is working. And what we have to remind ourselves as well is that, of course, a death can occur at any of these post-injury phases, right? It could be that proper treatment wasn't available right on scene, and so there's a preventable death there. It might have been that the evacuation procedures weren't working or something happened, so you have a death there, or even in the hospital, right? But the point being is there's these multiple intervention points that we should be looking more closely at if we want to start moving towards evidence-based care for rangers following an injury during their operations. And so why is this important? Why are all of you in this room? Of course, it's about ranger welfare, right? We have men and women operating in very dangerous environments, or sometimes even what could be low threat environments, who then have an injury or an illness that causes a death. And we need to be preventing that, right? From a ranger welfare perspective, this is really important. And if we start capturing better information about this, organizations at the organizational level could be better protecting their staff. But if we talk more about aggregating this data as well as a field or as a conservation sort of collective, we start moving towards what people would refer to as evidence-based medicine, and really looking for what are the best practices we should be using following certain injury types or certain mechanisms of injury. If we look at what's available now out there data-wise, pretty much the most common data, or the most available data, is related simply to the deaths of rangers, right? The IRF's Roll of Honor, they produced this report last year that shows, how many deaths are happening per year, and we're seeing that over the years there's more deaths being recorded. Now, this could be simply a result of better data recording, or maybe there is increased threat. But the point being is we have this death information, but we don't have anything kind of further back down the line, or if people are collecting it, it's not being made publicly available just yet. And if we zoom in a little bit on the data that's available, and you start breaking it down the way they've done in their report, we're finding that on average in Africa and Asia, you're seeing about 43 deaths a year, okay, across 5 categories. So they do say what was happening during the time of death, but not necessarily specific to what was the actual injury or what were the treatment protocols or evacuation protocols that were followed that maybe kept some people alive and other people weren't so lucky. If we combine that data with some of the data that Mike Appleton published last year as well, we can start to calculate death rates across the continents, again, using the available data that's there, showing that in Africa, you've got about 0.7 deaths per 1,000 rangers operating on the continent. Compared to other continents, it's almost twice as high than the next highest, right? Asia has maybe more deaths per year, but they also have a lot more rangers. Now, James is going to talk a little bit about some of the, this data, what's missing, what's there, why it's being underreported. We'll get into that later. But the point being is, these are some metrics we can start to look at. And if we track them over time, try to see if we're improving, success, if we're improving on protection and prevention, or if it's going the other way. And the other point that comes out of this data is that 60% of African ranger deaths were homicides, which usually means it's related to trauma, indicating that post-injury care in a trauma scenario becomes very, very important on this continent. Now, one of the ways that we've suggested to at least start capturing that treatment data, all of you on your seat, you should have one of these casualty card examples that Lead Ranger has developed. This is something that we've adapted from military medicine care. TCCC is what it's called, Tactical Combat Casualty Care. And what we're trying to do is give a data capture sort of standard that could be used not only in the field to improve, tracking what you've done to a casualty as they move out of the field into a hospital, but ultimately a way that you could retrospectively put this into a data system and start checking, what did people do and what was the outcome over time. Now, one of the things we're going to talk about on the panel is how would you go about doing this? How would you start moving towards a collective that's very interested in creating better evidence about this? And what we're sort of arguing for is setting a standard, making partnerships, starting small, and just remembering that quality over quantity is what we really need here. And if we start getting some organizations to participate, this is not only useful at an aggregated level, but even for your own organization, this type of data becomes very useful for understanding, where is the risk, what treatment protocols are being used, could they be improved? Because like it or not, you're going to end up with injuries during ranger operations, and the more you can prevent those from being serious or even deaths, the better. But also, if we think about this, individual organizations wearing different uniforms, having different data, if we're able to take that data and sanitize it, because we don't really necessarily care about the uniform a ranger's wearing, we care about that body, what's happened to it, has it been treated, did it work, we can start moving towards an aggregated view of what's going on across the continent or even the world related to ranger injuries and treatments to get a better idea about how we could improve best practice. We can definitely learn from other sectors as well. Eliminating preventable deaths on the battlefield. The United States Army Ranger Regiment actually achieved 0 preventable deaths. Now, of course, they come with much more capability than a lot of the organizations that are sitting in this room. But the point is they made a big focus of this, right? They made leadership buy into it. And that's what resulted in this really big achievement that you had 0 preventable deaths on a battlefield. But also this is very common in the similar line of work like firefighting, keeping good records of what's going on, because you can start to track, are firefighters, is it carcinogens that are causing them to die over time, or is it overexertion during some of the exercises that they're doing when they're on scene, especially differences between volunteer firefighters and maybe professional ones. And so this kind of mirrors the situation we're in. So again, without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our panel. And what we're going to try to do is have the panel chat a little bit, answer some of the discussion questions I've put together, and then obviously turn it over to the audience as well to hear from all of you some of your thoughts about this idea, or your thoughts about, would you be interested in learning more related to this ranger injury and death data? So here's the questions I'm going to kind of ask the panel to look at. And I'm going to start by giving the mic to Jeremy. And just, Jeremy, could you please just talk a little bit about the type of data we need? I've talked about it at a high level, but you also have experience capturing this type of data to help improve an organization's operations. So thanks, Jeremy.
Sure, thanks. So from my perspective, the data that's important is firstly coming from the rangers in the field, initiating after they've initiated treatment, sending the 9-line or a shortened version of the 9-line, whether it's just call sign and number of casualties, nature of injury, and request for pickup type and additional support. And then having a proactive ops room, well-trained and well-equipped ops room that's going to start to act on the workflow that's been set in place by the management of the protected area. And then once that's moving, that is going to set in place both the long-term storage of that data, but it's also more importantly going to set in place the ability to to initiate the evacuation because you want to get that ranger out of the field and then to definitive care.
Great. Anybody kind of want to add to that? Or?
Thank you. To my mind, there's 4 key elements to this. The first one being the initial threat assessment. So, right at the beginning of even going into a place, having a look at what the potential threats are and then preparing your operation around those potential threats. That's a key element. The second one is if a ranger becomes injured, that point of injury care. So what are you doing to equip your ranger with the skills to deal with that point of injury? And they talk about the golden hour. So you want to know that ranger is equipped with the skills to be able to keep their colleague alive for that golden hour, which is now giving the ops room, as Jeremy said, the time to arrange the evacuation process. The third element here I think is especially pertinent, and I would hazard a guess that this is the area where there's probably quite a lot of avoidable deaths happening, and that is in the prolonged field care. And the reason why I say pertinent to a conservation setting is because we're often out in very remote areas. We're nowhere near, professional medical care, and it's now trying to keep that ranger alive while we deal with the evacuation process. And sometimes there's, I was at Grimeti in the rainy season. You can't get to some of these places by road. So essentially these guys are having to look after themselves until that flood water comes down at certain times of the year. So it's these things that this is an especially pertinent part to this is the prolonged field care. And that's a very different type of training to the point of injury field care. And then the last bit is a pre-planned CASEVAC, and that's again where the management, the ops room come into play. They're the ones that are going to be pre-drilled, hopefully, and understand if this happens, what tools are available to us to get this person to the next echelon of medical care as quickly as possible. And the last thing I'll just say is that when there's been an injury, you want to make sure that you capture the necessary data to be able to do something about that, but you don't want to put that ranger on the ground under any more pressure than he'll already be. So we don't want to be capturing a whole lot of information that needs to be bang, bang, bang. The necessary information you get that you need in order to provide the necessary support to that ranger. Thank you.
To add to that, I mean, I think, the data at that site level is so important. And furthermore, in 2019, following the last World Ranger Congress, in which we had so many rangers attend and sort of speak out and formalize what their greatest needs were in what was called the Chitwan Declaration, we established a forum called the Universal Ranger Support Alliance. And that has been phenomenal in really getting some of that information of what those rangers need and what their greatest requirements are for professionalizing the ranger workforce internationally. And without data getting up to that high level, it's really challenging to make improvements to the well-being and the safeguarding of rangers, as well as improving working and employment conditions. So having that information at the site level not only improves the well-being and the ability to prevent deaths and injury at at the ground level, but filtering it up to the highest possible level gives us an opportunity to really challenge further, government institutions as well as things like the International Labour Organization to improve the overall standards in which we employ our ranger workforce.
Great, thanks a lot. I'm going to just move on to the next question, which Jes is perfect for you to talk about. Is, from an EarthRanger perspective and from just a data capture perspective, is this something that can be done? And then maybe you can speak a little bit about how you would envision storing this data and the ability to share it, obviously knowing that people are going to own their own data. But do you just want to speak about that a little bit?
Yeah, of course. At the other speakers, and by the way, I should say I feel a little bit like I've been pulled out of the audience to play cowbell with my favorite band here, but the ownership of data, certainly from an EarthRanger perspective, I'll also throw in SMART as well. All data is owned by the organization that is using the system and capturing the data, full stop in all cases. What we can offer this effort and this initiative. There's an implied request of the audience here to participate and to help contribute data to this cause so that these things can be known, because it's really the members of the audience here that are collecting these data that are necessary for the analysis. What we can help with is getting your data into a centralized location to the degree of specificity that you're comfortable with. So if a organization wants to share really high-level data, we can ensure that only high-level data is shared. If you are comfortable sharing a lot of very specific information about individual incidents, we can also help with that. So our commitment to this is basically that we'll enable you all, as much as you're comfortable, to participate. And then ultimately, where the data is stored, we can set up an EarthRanger instance for that. We can also feed that into a different system if that's necessary. I kind of want to say that the technical aspects of this are easy, frankly. It's really much more about the commitment and participation of the community to be comfortable with the data sharing so that it's available for analysis. From there, we can assure you that we can keep the data secure.
Beautiful. Thanks a lot. Moving down a little bit, Boris, I was wondering, because obviously to get something like this to work, we have to have buy-in. You need to have the right data frame. You need to have the right training in place. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how training could be used to help collect this information and integrate it into first aid training like Lead Ranger offers, for example.
Yeah, thanks. There's obviously a lot of people that do medical training, so it's not particular to one organization. But the most important thing, obviously, is that you have organizational buy-in. So management needs to believe that this is an important bit of information to collect and hold people accountable to it. And then once you go into the training, it is not really difficult to train people to use something like the casualty card that you have in front of you. We sort of chose the card regardless of whatever systems are being used, because those of you that have sat next to a damaged body trying to help it know that there's a lot of things you're doing. You're not so much interested in sort of data entry in a phone or something like that. And there's also a point where you will hand over this casualty to the next level of care, whoever it is. And that handover takeover, that continuity is also super important, because 2-3 steps down the line, people need to know what you did at that point of injury, to know where to pick up the treatment and what to look for. So in training-wise, it can be quite simple. Things like this, they got 2 holes in them. So it's a piece of elastic band that goes around it. You put it around the neck of the casualty, and everything that comes up, you just fill it in. And it can be super basic, right? And the moment that ranger hands this person over, he photographs the front and the back, and this thing stays with the casualty and just goes down all the way down the chain. So the doctor in the hospital will know what treatments were given. And then, once that information goes to headquarters, there's someone sitting there with clean hands, who can actually enter this information into the preferred data system. And so that works actually quite well. And then, from a training perspective, if Wes is actually attending the casualty, I'll be the scribe, I'll be next to him, he'll talk to me, and I'll just put it into the form. So, and if you just train that, it becomes second nature. So, yeah.
Anybody want to add on to that? Yes.
I think training is part of this, but it's a key part. And under the context of the question, how do we get buy-in? I think and please, crucify me if I've got this wrong, but I think a lot of places, and not just conservation, but any operational atmosphere, doesn't actually have a policy in place about how to deal with medical issues. And so I suppose, and I'm probably going to give you a plug now, that an organization like this can come in there and actually equip an organization with that whole policy so that people understand. I think everyone wants to prevent ranger deaths. So if there was a way of helping an organization do that effectively, I think that's your buy-in right there. And if you could come in and sort of help with, the policy, the evacuation, the training need, and all the rest of it as one package, I think that would be a key way of getting buy-in.
Thanks. Jeremy?
I think one thing that's pertinent is in terms of data collection, there are two levels of data use that we would envisage here. One at a global level that would support policy making, but the other would be at an organizational level that may never leave the organization or the protected area management. And I think that's the more important one, where, whichever situational awareness platform you're using, Smart EarthRanger, whichever, would have the ability to monitor, or you would have the ability to send up a casualty request that would be structured and that would facilitate best practice evacuation, and then from the field to HQ, and then from there out to definitive care, and then for management to be able to analyze those events over time and to detect weaknesses or abilities to make yourselves more efficient. And whether or not you decide to share that data outside is up to you, but I think internally you should be doing that as part of your structured operations and reflecting on how you function.
Thanks. James, would you talk a little bit about some of the problems we might see with this data capture, given your experience with just the roll of honor and the data that's been being captured about ranger deaths already?
Yeah, certainly. So, I mean, aside from the challenges of getting people in the field to collect accurate field data, which I think we've all probably experienced at some point or time, a lot of the information that we've had to date is coming from things like the Thin Green Line Foundation's Fallen Ranger Project, the Game Ranger Association of Africa's Ranger Protect, and the Ranger Federation of Asia is another big one. All of that information sort of gets fed up into this Ranger Roll of Honor, which is released every year on World Ranger Day. And really what it is, it's kind of a metric to really sort of show people, what is happening within the Ranger world in terms of, how many are lost each year, and it gives us an opportunity to sort of remember those who have been lost in the past year or so. But at the end of the day, the information that we're getting is really just, a rough cause of death, the country and the individual's name. And a lot more information is being collected by some organizations, and a lot less is being collected by others. And a lot of it is purely anecdotal. This information is being sourced from sort of WhatsApp groups, from Facebook. You've got individuals within these associations and things that spend time trolling through Google stories and things like that to find ranger deaths and injuries. But we're not even recording like the sort of major injuries or anything, or what could have been done to prevent them. And so what does it mean to say that, a ranger lost their life to homicide or to a vehicular incident? Was there drugs and alcohol involved? Was it environmental? Was it, due to lack of skills and training? None of that is captured at the moment. And so, trying to capture that, I think, has been a problem, because we've never really had a vehicle or a standard for it. Furthermore, when you're dealing with governments and things, obviously, governments don't always want to share sensitive information. They don't want to give out information that could potentially have loss of, or give them loss of face, or show that they've got shortcomings and so on. So it is quite challenging that front. And once you get outside of some of the major areas like Asia and Africa, even in the Caribbean or Central and South America, with indigenous guardians, community rangers, we're certainly not getting as much information from those sort of locations as we should be. So creating more of a standard, a more sort of unified approach to collecting this information is really the only way to sort of resolve the major problem that we have, in which within the ranger sector there is still not a lot of information. And what we're really trying to push for is for governments and countries and everybody to sort of think about the standard of internationally when it comes to your other services, firefighters, ambulatory police officers, things like that. There are metrics collected for that. You can look up a lot of information on that. If you want to try to find out the number of ranger deaths in a country, you'll probably only get a few examples. And so why is it that the environmental sector is not sort of elevated up to that level? And that's really something that we're trying to push forward to in order to resolve that problem.
James, is it maybe an idea to comment on that a little bit as well?
I'm always happy for Andrew to make some comments if he would so wish.
Yeah, I think this is a good time to sort of maybe open it up. Andrew, you can give some comments from the audience. If you have questions or ideas, we're going to just kind of turn it over to the audience now as well. But Andrew, please.
Thanks. Yeah, I didn't make the boy band, so my singing's not good enough. But yeah, James, I think that and the key point there, right, for me is the lack of data. You know, having kept that ranger roll, so we've got a detailed ranger roll that we keep at Game Rangers Association of Africa. That goes from 2012 to now, 2023. And what we've tried to do there is take it to the next level of detail. Those first few years, and you'll see it in the data there, where the ranger deaths in Africa are around 50. Generally, that's when the reporting was really bad. I think the reporting of deaths has improved. And I think the International Ranger Federation changed how they record the deaths as well. So we now have a better data in the last sort of 5 or 8 years or so. But you'll see that significant rise from sort of 50 a year to now it's more or less 80 to 100 rangers a year in Africa. The key there is there's still dead spots in the data. So Angola is a good example. The first official ranger death in Angola was probably 2 years ago, according to the ranger roll. We know that's obviously not the case. We've got better, contact with the ministry there now. We're starting to get that information through, but it's a real struggle. If you look at North Africa, there's a handful of rangers have died in North Africa since 2012, according to the ranger roll. We know that that's not the case on the ground, but to get that information is really difficult when we don't have contacts on the ground. As James said, some of this is just, it can be a text from a ranger in the park to say we lost a guy today, and that's all you get. And you might get a name and a cause of death. The other thing is even so the cause of death and the injuries that are sustained really important, right? And when we did Jeremy was involved with the African Ranger First Aid Guidelines. That was one of the key things we said is we don't have the data, but we looked at case examples from the ecotourism industry where guides and other people working in remote areas were getting injured. We had quite a lot of data on that. And one of the key data sets is from the insurers, right? So between African Parks, GRAA, and the 4 Rangers group, we've got a data set of about 5,000 to 6,000 rangers insured. And there we have good data, right? Because we know exactly when we make a payment of why that ranger died, how he died, we sometimes have bad data from the site, exactly what happened, he bled out. Okay, well, where was that injury? Was it an upper limb, or was it the other thing is just the cause of death. I think a lot of stuff is lost in the I guess the broad strokes that we apply when we say, homicide, right? And so one of the things that's not widely known, I think in the industry we know it, but everyone, rangers are getting killed by poachers, right? That's the narrative that you'll read in the paper. According from 2012, 50% of the ranger deaths that we've recorded are due to homicide, and 50% of those are due to militia groups operating in Central and West Africa. So, the leading cause of death is actually contacts with militia groups. If you take it to that level, and I think that's not widely recognized in the press. So I think it's sometimes broader than just the nature of the injury, but is what is causing that, and going down to that of it's not so much. And you look at the most dangerous country to be a ranger is DRC. Second most dangerous, Kenya is one of them. It's up there in South Africa. So is that due to reporting? Or in Kenya, a lot of rangers lose their life in interactions with pastoralists and herders. So you really got to go down to the detail, and the more detail we can get, the better. And that's why I like what you guys are doing here. We really need this data, but I think that the insurance mechanism is a really interesting way of getting the detail that we need. Because ultimately they're sending the medevac. They get the case file, they get the data coming from the site. So, yeah, that's my 5 cents. Thanks.
Beautiful. Thank you. Anyone on the panel want to follow up, or Jeremy?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I think one thing just to add to that is, deaths and cause of deaths are a very important driver. And I think in addition to that, it's important to look at processes, because if we look at how we performed in conducting an evacuation, in addition to the cause of death, we can also look at long-term quality of life of those rangers, if in the event of a survival, or if we take it back to the definition of a preventable death, if someone bled out or if someone did not receive the appropriate care, if we defined a definitive care facility incorrectly, then we need to look at how are we what are we doing for our people? Are we putting in place the correct care facilities in country? And I think that's another useful process that we can put in place if we have this sort of data.
I was just going to quickly add, just to give a little bit of context again from that international perspective. Working with colleagues and things in Central America, especially, they'll record deaths because of interactions with cartels as accidents, because they don't want to put that out. We work with a number of rangers in Haiti, and one of the leading causes of ranger deaths that we know is that they're actually kidnapped. And they're kidnapped because they're operating as civil servants, for example, and that's just not being reported. And so finding that safe, anonymized means of reporting this information, I think will give people a lot more of a foundation and just the ability to come forward with this without fearing that there might be ramifications from either their employer or from external sources and things. So I just can't stress the importance of that enough.
Yeah, Tina, and then just there.
Thank you. I just wanted to add something about the kind of data. I think it's also important to verify it. I remember, I think it was last year, we had a huge increase in deaths of rangers in DRC. And actually, when we started verifying it, it was like, it was not true. So I feel that's when in the context where we are working, when there is an incentive, a financial incentive, then the data can increase. And I think it's really important to have a system in place also to be able to verify this data.
Yeah, just a small comment. There's obviously, in the whole chain of events that lead up to a catastrophic event and what happens after, there's a lot of things, including the context, that is really interesting to know. But from a medical standpoint, we really want to know, once a body is damaged, what treatment was given at the point of injury, and then what happened on the way to definitive care, and then ultimately whether someone recovers or is at a certain level of disability or passes away. And that gives us a lot of opportunities in regards to the medical side of things. Like it was said earlier, are my people trained up to do this? Do we have an evacuation plan in place? Is that based on a proper risk assessment? Is it tested regularly? Right? All these sort of basic things. And, some places, indeed, you can have the golden hour. Other places, you need to be in a canoe for 3 days, literally, to get somewhere where you can get treatment. I mean, the medical ramifications of that is mind-boggling and almost unsurmountable. You almost need to have, a role one on site, a certain level of hospital or care on site if you want to get it right. So, but but yeah, and then additionally, that context that led up to it is then something that you can separately also look at in regards to, you know, if this is our main threat, you know, how can we adjust our operations to deal with that? But in regards to preventable deaths in ranger operations, you're really looking at the body is damaged, what happens to it, and how does it recover or not, and what can we do better, sort of thing.
Great.
Yeah.
I just want to, I'm from Kruger. Through our operations control room, what we learned lessons is like if the rangers get injured either through contact or by an animal, is we always running around to look for his record, because that's what the first thing they want. So we kept a file on each ranger of his record, so the ID copy of his ID, and then we also fill in the employer's record for the injury on duty, and we send that through immediately through to the hospital, where either by ambulance or by helicopter. So when the ranger arrived there, everything is already in place. So for what I'm letting everyone know is to keep a record of all your rangers on hand, so you can just pull out the file and send it through to the hospital.
Yeah, awesome. If I can just quickly add to that, and then I'll shut up. Yeah, but it's you know, one industry that really got this right is the aviation industry, the safest industry in transport in the world. And they do it by a full commitment to that safety, which means that you diligently report your near misses as well. Stuff that doesn't necessarily go wrong, but could have gone wrong very quickly. You know, there may have been just one safeguard left to stop a catastrophic outcome. But that is really, I think, to sort of, you know, ourselves as we're sitting here, management, people that run parks that are in charge of this, to you know, at least organizationally make that commitment that you're going to be, you know, brutally honest about these things happening in the field. And I think it's the only way to sort of learn and get better at it, you know. Yeah.
Hi, I'm going to apologize if this is a naive question. But I guess my question for the panel, but also for others in the room, is what is the response you get about the reluctance or the refusal to share information about ranger deaths? Because I find it really perplexing visiting national parks and protected areas, and there's not a memorial to rangers that have fallen. There's not a signpost. If you ask, there's little to no guidance on that. I think it's really important for the public, especially those who are visiting places, to be aware that this is a dangerous job to keep these places going. There are a lot of risks, and I think that there is, at least in places I've encountered, reluctance to share information about kind of the dark side of the work that is conducted. I visited a national park earlier this year in a country and place I won't name, but a ranger died the day before I was there. And there was a whole hidden discussion whether or not they would tell me that this happened. We don't want to let the funder know about this. And so I was really concerned because this is a morale issue. This is a esprit de corps issue. And taking care of rangers is also part of this, and their families. So I'm just curious, what is the reluctance to share information about ranger deaths, and are there things that can be implemented that ensure that there is awareness about the critical role that rangers play in protected areas, and just knowledge about that? So.
Yeah, I can try and help there. Yeah, I think it's you know, there's quite a lot of complexity around why things aren't reported. I think one of the issues is the terminology in the industry. So, you know, ranger, we're all familiar with the term ranger. In many countries, you know, people, even what we would consider rangers, don't classify themselves as rangers. We had a chat in the previous discussion with the Marine, the MPA guys. You know? A lot of Marine rangers don't consider themselves rangers, but when we look at the work that they do, we consider them rangers. You know? So sometimes when you ask for ranger deaths, you know, ranger can be a rank. In Zambia, ranger's a rank, right? It's not, you know, you have a scout, you have a game guard, you have a warden, you have a watcher, you have a forest watcher, you have, you know, there's probably 30 to 40 different terms just in Africa for people doing the same job. So I think some of it's because of that. Other, it's just not having the channel into that country. You know, like I say, North Africa is just this abyss of lack of information, and that's on us, right? As the industry, we need to establish those channels. And then I think there is almost like a acknowledgement of failure. It's quite hard because that's the ultimate failure, right? If your rangers are dying in the field in an incident, and things like negligence and was it preventable, was it not? So sometimes it is kept reasonably quiet. I think with the honor roll, there is amongst the rangers themselves, they want to report these things, right? They want to see their colleagues acknowledged on that honor roll. And I think that's the incentive at the moment. And we need to create more incentives around that is, please, we need this information. And James, I mean, you've sent out millions of emails over the years and from RF and from GRA and that around trying to get the figures. We want as accurate figures as we can get, bearing in mind what Tina says. A year or two ago, we had inaccurate figures because, there's a group of people starting to report deaths, hoping that they can apply to the thin green line and get payouts. So we need to be aware of that now. That's the reality. So it's a tough one. I hope I've answered it to a degree, and then maybe we can have a chat afterwards. But the other thing is around injuries. Like you think the lack of data around deaths is bad. Try injuries. There's nothing out there besides at a park level. Guys might record a bit, and like I think Boris mentioned it now. Those near calls, we want to know where certain interventions, prevented a loss of life or a loss of limb. The injury side of it. When we're trying to come up with things like first aid training guidelines, we also want to, prevent catastrophic injuries, and there's just zero data or very limited data on that. So we have to go and feel. The other thing, I did want to mention something else, but I can't remember right now. But those are I think the injury data are really important, and that gets left behind in this conversation sometimes. I know the other one was around preventable deaths. Even now, when we're thinking preventable deaths, we're thinking around bleed outs, not having a tourniquet, not having the right training on the ground. Also bear in mind preventable deaths like drownings, like poor equipment, like vehicles that rangers are driving that the steering goes, and a lot of rangers die in car accidents and drownings and other things, and those are all preventable, but not sometimes classified as preventable deaths. We think of someone who's been shot and bleeds out as a preventable death.
Just to add on to that, a lot of times you find that after an incident, there is a kind of a mute on communications from the operations management, just due to the requirement from government partners, and also the need to inform the family. But then, once the dust has settled, then in my experience, there has always been memorialization in various forms. But I think it is natural after there has been a fatality that there's going to be a little bit of communication blackout, and people are going to be restrained on what they can say. But then you'll find afterwards that you'll have memorials and reports that do speak to the losses in the various protected areas.
And I'll phrase this kind of as an answer, but also kind of as a question, just because I don't have any firsthand experience in this. But it seems to me that one of the obvious answers might be tourism. A lot, I don't know the percentage, but a lot of these protected areas survive on tourism. If you announce how many rangers are dying there, that sends a signal that some of these could be dangerous places that you might not want to go. I don't want to call out anyone in particular, but since the whole gist of this conference is that we're among friends, I think it'd be really interesting to see the data trends of revenue of Queen Elizabeth National Park over the last few years. And you take a look at the overall numbers of these parks versus others, and really how much more dangerous is one versus the other, but some certainly get a lot of press for individual incidents that I'm very willing to bet have real impact on their visitation. I have a few folks at the conference from Virunga. There's probably not a lot of tourism going to Virunga at the moment, and so I think it's an unfortunate problem to have, but one that, and I have no idea what the answer is, but one that needs to be solved is how do you report these data without having negative consequences for the organizations that are reporting it? So.
Yeah, I think it is important to note as well. Just the African region probably has the highest standard of ranger welfare, maybe with the exception of places in Europe or North America, but sort of in many other places, especially where I've worked, rangers, they don't have first aid kits. They have zero medical training. They're sent out into the field, 5 kilograms of rice on their back, and that's about it, and expected to do the job. And so when there is an incident, of course, the government is not going to report that. And, many places, they have a very different view of death as well. So it's kind of hushed. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to think about it. And, there's so many compounding factors, and that's sort of what we're talking about in creating an enabling environment for people to report this is so important because, not just again from that sort of site level or from through an avenue like a regional ranger association or something, for example, but also putting more pressure on governments internationally to improve those overall working conditions and employment conditions for rangers, which should include, all of these methods of being able to prevent deaths and then accurately report when there are injury and deaths in order for, organizations to think about how to better improve those standards going forward. So, there is pressure coming, but it's, it's such a diverse network of within the whole vocation, it's very fragmented, really, and so we're only just sort of really scratching the surface of just how fragmented it really is. So.
Just a quick question. Is data over recent years been showing an upward trend in sort of the psychological side of the activity of the range as well, with, family problems, suicides, and their access to counseling and things like that? Because we've definitely seen an increase in that over the years, and it is probably one of the most active, real forces on the planet, to be honest. Yeah, these guys are out there putting their life on the line all the time, and it has a huge social impact on them.
I would like to give you some sort of an answer to that. In terms of family problems and suicides, I have no record of that. There are probably other people here who do, but alcoholism is a big one. And seeing your top good people start resorting to alcohol and unfortunately in many cases losing their job because of it. And funnily enough, when I shared that I was talking on this panel on LinkedIn, there was somebody who reached out to me about ranger resilience and ranger welfare, who I'm going to try and talk to about this because it is something that we recognized as a problem, quite a bit. So I think that's a very, very important point to bring out. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll shut up in a minute as well. But, adding to that a little bit, yeah, absolutely. There have been more studies and things gone into trauma affecting rangers and so on. But in many cases, suicide is not reported because of the sort of taboo element to it in a lot of cultures, as well as the fact that, people don't treat it as part of, it wasn't part of an operational duty. So why would you report that? It's not part of it. They don't connect the dots between that, or they don't want to. So it's not being accurately recorded, and it's not being included in the Ranger Roll of Honor in many cases because of that fact. So.
Yeah, just on that. So at the moment, suicides they're not shown on the RF Roll of Honor. We keep a record of those, because we keep non-operational deaths as well, but they're very, very low reporting levels. And it's something I know Chris at RF, they're trying to get information on that because, especially the sort of post-COVID years, a lot of retrenchments, hard times, economic hard times, how do we get more information on that? We suspect that we know that it's a problem, and anecdotally, you speak to rangers, and a lot of guys that have been in the industry for a long time, they've lost guys to this, yeah? And like any profession, this is happening, but it's not getting recorded. My personal feeling is we should be recording those because Often it's to do with what's happening at work.
Yeah, so I'll go here and then here. Thanks.
Hey guys, can I just say thanks very much for tackling an incredibly important subject. I mean, collecting the data and all the rest of it is fantastic, first step, all that sort of stuff. But actually, as Boris has already highlighted, part of a lessons learning process. The duty of care really is this idea that you don't want to make the same mistake twice. I think one of the things I want to return back to a point that came from the panel, recognising that there's this learning process, and also going back to your opening slide where people try and apportion blame. It's being very grown up about a learning process and not trying to put pressure or additional effort back down on things. So when you're looking at analysing how a death occurred and how rangers responded, when you go through that learning process, how you don't actually end up putting additional pressure on the rangers again because you did this wrong, you did that wrong. And I'd be interested from the experience on the panel, how when you get those really nutty lessons learned about what they could have done better, how you take those lessons and then reintroduce it back on the rangers on that one. Sorry, Jim.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. That's a good comment. I mean, organizationally, as everybody knows who has lost rangers or has been in the proximity of that, it's a very traumatic event for everyone involved. And the most important thing you should do with that is learn from it, exactly like you say. You don't want to do it again. So a non-confrontational, no-consequence debrief is super important. And it doesn't matter if someone really messed up in the process, completely messed it up. It is my experience that in a situation like that, people don't mess up on purpose. It is the whole thing that happens and the overwhelmingness of it that will have people make mistakes, which is something that you should talk about, you should identify, and you can start mitigating, right? So having that environment is super important. And then, what comes out of that is a lesson identified, and a lesson identified is not yet a lesson learned. It will be a lesson learned once you implement what you're going to do with it. All right, are we going to change our training? Are we going to change our equipment? Are we going to change our procedures? Anything like that, right? And that whole process is super important. And you can do that inside your park. Nobody needs to know about this, right? If this is something that you want to talk about, that is what you should do in your park. Yeah. That's it.
I think perhaps it's a bit of a capacity issue, but how we resolved that issue, or how we solved that issue, was to have our internal training team, 2, 3, 4 guys whose sole job it is to make sure that they're keeping the rest of the guys upskilled. And I know not everyone can afford to do that, but I do think it's a very important factor that one should consider, is that you have your internal training team. And then when any external training happens, it's almost like a train the trainer, and those guys are equipped. And when you're doing this lessons learning thing, as what Boris said, you've got an entity within your own organization where you can quickly turn that lesson into a drill to be prevented down the line. So I do think that's really important, but it's a capacity issue. Some people can't have a dedicated training team.
And I think sometimes if the problem is big enough or the threat is severe enough, it can even come to the point of institutional reflection and change of management plan, bringing in new donors, bringing in bigger capacity on the ground, and that's just all dictated by the situation. And again, better data collection on the ground drives better decision making.
Cool, yeah, I'll try to keep it quick. Just to pick up on 2 points that were already made. Well, first of all, to say, yeah, thank you for this work, and it's exciting to think that one day that curve might start bending the other way in terms of deaths. I think in terms of the data needed, and this point was already made, if you can identify situations where a death was prevented and what conditions that death was prevented under, that's a really important auxiliary data set to where death happened and why it happened. But I understand that that's a huge challenge in terms of identifying when a death might have happened or not. But just a point on that. I think the point was already made. But secondly, and I think perhaps more importantly, I know when you asked the question on buy-in, that training came up, and I totally agree with Wesley about how training perhaps is not the biggest problem, and I think Jes said as well that the technology is not that complicated, but the buy-in, and I know I mean, I'm an academic, so a lot of the literature is there that is what affects whether organizations choose to adopt a technology or not, and it's really two big things stand out is how much effort is it going to take to start recording this data, and secondly, is it going to help? And my question is, so how will the collection of these data, and I think it will, but I'm interested to hear you say, how will the collection, storage, and analysis of this data lead to prevented deaths? And could perhaps you give a tangible example? I know, for example, having that card around the neck may help the hospital better diagnose the problem and give the appropriate care. But how does the long-term analysis of these data translate into reduced ranger deaths? Could you perhaps give a part?
Outcomes of that was training, realization that under pressure, you're not going to remember everything. So it needs to be very simple steps and a piece of equipment that's very easy to use. So the CAT tourniquet that we all use now, that was a direct result of that. The Asherman chest seal, another for the sucking chest wound. And of course, the airway burn was a bit more complex, but it could be solved with a trachea. And of the 3 injuries, the only one that couldn't be administered on the ground at the point of injury was the trachea, unless there was a fully trained medic. But so, and that really made a big help. But I mean, that's in a different environment. But perhaps
I can add just a little bit. Sorry, you want to go ahead, Jen? Okay. Just, Andy touched on it very briefly, but the data that has come into use within other sectors, I think, is going to have an influence on what we're looking at here. And I like to continually use that example from firefighters, because you have volunteer firefighters, professional firefighters, and so on. And previously, without that data, it was assumed, as Andy touched on, that it was carcinogens that were killing the most firefighters, or trauma, or so on. With data, they actually found that the leading cause was heart attacks. It was cardiovascular issues. So what ended up happening was that data has now influenced things like lighter gear, better quality equipment. You've gone from those big steel tanks to carbon fiber tanks. Much more lightweight, better understanding of how to rotate out teams. All of these things, that can then provide and help to influence industry standards, and that's where I think the data can really help the sort of preventable deaths and things and so forth.
One also, like a really simple one that we found as well was a lot of people ask, why does it have to be 4 people to go out? Why is it 8? The bottom line is you can carry someone out. When you go to some parts where 2 people go, and you wonder why casualty isn't being moved, or it was a prolonged hazard. Because people just hadn't thought through, oh dear, a branch on a tree might come down and knock someone in the head and you've got to carry the guy out. But that's why a lot of these little basic things like that come into play.
Just to say that you should tell those stories, because they're powerful.
Okay, so, yeah.
When you're trying to get people to buy and show it, this is preventive. And I actually lost a lot. I'm sure you do that already, but it's those stories that I think get people to buy in. Why should we connect this data?
Great, thanks, Tim. Jeremy, do you want to add one last thing? We're just at time.
Yeah, sure. No, I think in terms of user interface, you're talking about how it's going to be collected, and those exist already on the EarthRanger platform. So you have your medevac, I think it's a 5-line or 6-line, and you have your mist report. That's already there. So it's just getting teams to consistently use it, and that goes to rendering care in the field, following procedures, contacting through to the ops room, and then initiating the evacuation at the same time as the field evacuation protocol at the same time as the protocol is going to evacuate the ranger from the field. And those tools exist, so it's a question of using them.
Great. So because we're at time, I just wanted to kind of. If people want to stay around, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Otherwise, we can chat afterwards. I just don't want to keep people from their lunch. But just first of all, a huge thanks to the panel. Thanks all of you for being here. It's a really interesting topic. One of the reasons we can't answer Tim's last question very well is because we barely have any of this, huh? Especially the injury point. Like, what's preventable? Well, what's the injury? That's like, so if there's one takeaway message from us, I think it's please just really start considering if you're running operations, there's loads of opportunities to be collecting better data, even if it's just for yourself, just for your own rangers. But if we take that and aggregate it over time, it's going to become powerful. And these cards that we've handed out, these are what led to the developments that Wes just talked about. Every soldier was wearing something similar to this, and the aggregated data that came off of cards like this resulted in 0 preventable deaths in some of these Army Ranger regiments. So please, we're looking anywhere left of Bay, anywhere here, we want to prevent it. And it's up to the collective to think about how that data gets together. We're down to help out. If you scan the QR code on the back, there's a form you can fill in to keep in touch. We're going to try to form a bit of a cohort of people who are interested and try to integrate it with training and whatnot. But again, let's give a round of applause to the panel. They did a great job. Enjoy your lunch, and there's plenty more days to chat with any of us about this, so thanks a lot.